Welcome to Fireside Gaming. I'm Billum, and after, 3 years? Man, it's been a while. Either way, it's time to revisit the mainline Pokemon games with a look at Pokemon Gold. And to get this out of the way real quick, Pokemon Gold is the version I played as a kid. That's why it's the one I'm checking out for this retrospective. I know I could have gone into Pokemon Crystal instead, but I've never been particularly drawn to it. On top of that, my wife was already playing through it at the time I started playing Gold for this video, so it didn't feel right for both of us to play the same Pokemon game. And I guess I'll throw in a spoiler warning here real quick, just in case you haven't played these games yet. Just know that I'm not restricting story stuff to any specific part of the video, nor am I planning to do a deep dive into the story either. By now, you no doubt know the Pokemon formula. Get a starter from the local professor, catch Pokemon, earn 8 gym badges, and then beat the Elite Four. And Pokemon Gold does follow this formula, but it goes
even further beyond!
See, the second generation of Pokemon games start in Johto as compared to Generation 1's Kanto region. What sets them apart is the ability to return to Kanto once you've beaten the Elite Four. This is a unique feature of this generation, as other mainline Pokemon games don't allow the player to return to previous regions. This is a huge expansion to the game and sees players get a lot more out of it. And it is nice to return to Kanto a few years after the original generation and see what's changed, like Misty being away from her gym on a date, or how Cinnabar Island got mostly wiped out by a volcanic eruption, leaving Blaine operating the gym out of the Seafoam Islands instead. I also love that Koga moves up to the Elite Four, leaving his daughter to take over as the gym leader for Fuchsia. And with Giovanni gone, Blue, the rival of Gen 1, is now serving as the gym leader of Viridian City. What's also interesting is that this plays into Pokemon Gold and the other Gen 2 games acting as sequels to the Gen 1 games. That's not to say that we play the same characters as we did in Gen 1, but we get to see the follow-up to many of the events from those games. We are still a youth ready to tackle their first Pokemon journey and all that comes with it. But what's interesting is how the Gen 2 games take place roughly 3 years after the Gen 1 games. This mimics the gap between the release of the first Generation 1 games and the Generation 2 games. And now that I think about it, that's also about the time difference between my first Pokemon review and this one. I wish I could say that that was like an intentional thing, but I promise I'm really not that much of a mastermind planner. And it's also interesting to note that with this further building of the world of Pokemon comes some changes to how it tells its story. Remember in Gen 1 how the main focus was on beating the gym leaders and progressing to the Elite Four, and Team Rocket was kind of just this side thing that you dealt with along the way? Like, it was always more happenstance that you were foiling their plans than your actual intention. That's not quite the case in Gen 2. The remnants of Team Rocket are still around and causing trouble, and they aren't necessarily our focus. Even so, we get wrapped up with them once more. However, each of these times is due to someone else requesting our help. This gives the presentation a little extra flair, if you will. Instead of just stumbling on Team Rocket and beating them, we are actively being recruited to stop their evil plans, like cutting off the tails of these poor Slowpoke and selling them for ridiculous prices. This even sees Elite Four member Lance recruit us at one point to stop Team Rocket from using radio waves to evolve the Magikarp at the Lake of Rage into Gyarados. That also nets us a red Gyarados if we choose to catch it, which is the introduction of shiny Pokemon to the series. For the record, shinies are just Pokemon of a different color that are rare to find. Sometimes the color swap looks cool, but most of the time I'm not a big fan of them. But even more than these two events, we are tied to Team Rocket in this game thanks to Silver. Silver is the rival character of the Gen 2 Pokemon games, much like how Blue was to Red in the Gen 1 games. And you would maybe think that that means that we are named Gold, but we're named Ethan. Don't ask me why. However, there's something very interesting about Silver. He's the son of Giovanni, the former boss of Team Rocket. And while he starts the game out by stealing a Pokemon, he has no love for Team Rocket and wants to see the group disbanded for good. Now, don't get things confused here. This isn't because Silver is a good person. Instead, it's simply that he thinks Team Rocket is weak and can't stand weakness. However, he does grow from this mentality throughout the game and eventually realizes that he needs to treat Pokemon well. There are also other quests along the way, like helping heal a lighthouse Pokemon for Jasmine, which allows her to return to her gym so we can battle her. We also get to help Professor Elm, Johto's version of Oak, study the birth and breeding of Pokemon. Breeding is a major new mechanic in this game, with the Pokemon Daycare now being able to hold 2 Pokemon at a time. This lets players breed their Pokemon, which can net them eggs that will hatch into new Pokemon. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff that goes into breeding, such as how stats are handed down and determining the Pokemon that comes from an egg, but I'm not really all that into that stuff. I just throw a Ditto in with whatever Pokemon I want an egg from, and I leave it at that. And while we're talking about new mechanics in this generation, I love the inclusion of the Pokegear. It's a borderline smartphone that allows players to store trainer phone numbers, access radio stations, maps, and other things. With it, we can even re-challenge prior trainers by sharing our phone number with them. There's also a fun day and night system with the game tracking what time it is in the real world. This is one of the best, if not the best part of Gen 2. The fact that there are events that take place on certain days, like the bug catching contest, or that different Pokemon show up at day and night, are downright amazing changes compared to Gen 1. The item storage system also got a major overhaul, which separates them into different groups, such as normal items, TMs and HMs, and Pokeballs. That last one is worth noting, as Generation 2 adds loads of new Pokeballs players can craft through the Apricorn system. Granted, it doesn't really matter much, as most of the new Pokeballs aren't really worth using over the base, Great, and Ultra Balls. Now, if only the game offered a way to get more than one Master Ball. That would really help with tracking down the new legendary Pokemon added in Generation 2. And that's because Gen 2 introduces the roaming legendaries mechanic. The 3 legendary beasts, Raikou, Entei, and Suicune, all roam the map after the player first runs into them during the main story, and each of these pain in the butts will flee from battle the first chance they get. This is one of those things that I both love and hate about Gen 2. The idea of randomly running into a legendary Pokemon is incredibly cool, and it always gets me excited when I see one. Until I realized that I never stood a chance at catching it because I didn't have a specific Pokemon first in my party to hit it with sleep. Because of that, players are just going to try and track down a legendary beast through the ability to see where they are on the map and then run in circles until they meet them, and then try to catch them over and over again. In that regard, I'd much prefer the way the legendary birds are handled in Gen 1, because at least I can easily retry those battles quickly if I fail. And because of this, whenever I saw my first legendary beast after getting the Master Ball, I just chucked it at him and called it a day, completely ignoring the other 2. This time it was Suicune. Maybe next time it'll be Raikou or Entei. Who knows? And even with that annoyance, I did go through the effort of catching Lugia and Ho-Oh because their encounters are set up the same way as the Gen 1 legendary birds, making the process much easier and way less grindy. It also just dawns on me that the birds are the ones that sit still and just let you try to catch them over and over again, but the ground-based legendaries are the ones always taking off that we can't catch. Something doesn't seem right about that. Of course, there is one final challenge that players no doubt want to take on in Pokemon Gold and the other Gen 2 games, and that's Mount Silver. This mountain is home to some of the strongest Pokemon in the game, as well as one trainer we don't want to miss out on battling. At the peak of the mountain is Red, the current Pokemon champion and our player character from the Generation 1 games. He is sporting an incredibly powerful team with a level 81 Pikachu, level 73 Espeon, level 75 Snorlax, and the fully evolved forms of each of the Gen 1 starters, each at level 77. For my battle against him, I went in with my Feraligatr Dinfortis, my Donphan Donargos, and my Ampharos Canella at level 51, and my Slugma Infara, my Noctowl Calvis, and my Steelix Saxrum were at level 50. And if you think I was too low of a level to be doing this fight, you might be right. I was defeated a couple of times, but kept playing with the Pokemon order and strategy, as well as finally using all of those healing items I'd been hoarding throughout the game until I won. Truthfully, Red's Espeon and Snorlax were the only major hurdles to get over, as the rest of his team went down fairly easily even with my underleveled party. You might also be looking at my team and thinking that's not a very balanced lineup, and you aren't wrong. My philosophy with Pokemon games has always been to play with the Pokemon I like, not the Pokemon that make the most sense for a given battle. And that resulted in me picking my favorite Gen 2 Pokemon for this run. Additionally, I specifically limited myself to not using Generation 1 Pokemon that are in the game to force me to rely on the new Pokemon introduced in this generation. I also like to name all of my Pokemon to give me a bit of a more personal connection to them. I did this in my Generation 1 review as well if you want to check that out. Also, I have to give a shout out to my Ariados Aranea for being a standout member of my party during the first half of the game. She only got switched out after I linked up with my wife to do some trading. This allowed me to get a Slugma earlier than the return to Kanto, as well as adding me a Donphan to the party, which isn't available in Gold and has to be traded from another game. We also traded my Saxrum with a metal coat equipped to evolve him from an Onyx to a Steelix. My wife was such a huge help in getting me all of the Pokemon I wanted for my perfect Generation 2 Dream Team, and I really appreciate her assistance. So if I haven't said it yet, thank you, Aaliyah. And now that I think about it, I really do need to get her that Totodile I bred for her. That poor thing's been sitting in my box since before I beat the Johto part of Gold. With all of that covered, I do have to levy one major complaint against Pokemon Gold and its Gen 2 siblings. The second part of the game is kinda boring. Don't get me wrong, I've already said that I like going back to Kanto and seeing all of the changes, but from a gameplay perspective, it doesn't offer much in the way of challenge. And that's because the Gym Leader's Pokemon aren't leveled nearly high enough to feel like a proper continuation of the battles we had in Johto. Here's the thing. I get that it wouldn't make sense for all of the Gym Leaders in Kanto to be rocking Pokemon well into their 50s and 60s. If that happened, no one in Kanto will ever end up challenging the Elite Four. But from a pure gameplay perspective, they should be, as it would lead better into that final battle with Red on Mount Silver. It would grant the player the experience they need to get closer to the level of Red's Pokemon rather than being underleveled like I was. The sheer amount of grinding I would have had to have done to get closer to the Red's level is insane. It would have made for a major halt in the story progression right at the end of the game and wouldn't have been satisfying. Which is part of the reason why I decided to take him down with my low-level team. Well, that and I love going into battles underleveled in RPGs, the extra challenge makes it more enjoyable for me. And just to get another small complaint out of the way, Game Freak, why do you hate me so? You fixed Venusaur being a pile of lettuce in Gen 1 only to give Donphan the worst back sprite out of any Generation 2 Pokemon. Like, how did you think a trunk coming up from the bottom of the screen was a good way to represent this? If I didn't know better, I'd have thought a Kizu somehow ended up in my Generation 2 Pokemon game. Don't get me wrong, the vast majority of the sprite work in Pokemon Gold is great and a major upgrade over the Generation 1 games. It just so happens that one of my favorite Pokemon from Gen 2 got majorly screwed over in the back sprite department. But if there's one thing that I have no complaints about, it's the music. Pokemon Gold has an awesome soundtrack, there's loads of new music to listen to, and yet it all perfectly fits alongside the music we already got in Generation 1. Considering just how much of a sequel Gen 2 is to 1, that makes complete sense. Overall, I do still really enjoy Pokemon Gold and the second generation of Pokemon games. We get loads of great new Pokemon designs, the game serves as a fun sequel to Gen 1, and the return to Kanto is a welcome addition, even if I do think there are some problems with its pacing. Heck, I split my playthrough of this game into two for this review because I just didn't feel like going to Kanto after beating the Elite Four. I know it's technically post-game, but as far as side content goes, it feels like part of the main game that you have to do, which makes the game way longer than its Gen 1 or Gen 3 counterparts. But I'm getting off track. I'm not handing out a score to Pokemon Gold, but I will say that I can recommend it. It basically takes everything about the Pokemon formula from the Gen 1 games and improves on it, all while adding a fun new selection of Pokemon to enjoy. Man, I wish I could have fit a Gramble into my party for this run, but it didn't pan out. He's one of my favorites from Gen 2 as well. Sorry, I'm getting distracted again. Thanks for checking out my Pokemon Gold ramblings, and until next time, take it easy.